The echo of polished shoes against marble tiles reverberated through the high-ceilinged courtroom as the crowd shuffled into their seats. A hushed anticipation filled the air, a silence heavy with both curiosity and scandal. Everyone knew this wasn't an ordinary divorce trial, it was a spectacle. The kind of drama that newspapers thrived on and gossip mongers feasted upon. At the center of the storm sat Ramiz, the millionaire whose empire stretched from luxury hotels to global investments. He looked every inch the powerful man-tailored navy suit, silk tie, his wristwatch gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Yet it wasn't the wealth that caught people's attention. It was the smug curl of his lips as he leaned back in his chair, confidence dripping from every pore. Beside him, with calculated poise, was Neha, the mistress, who had walked boldly into the life of a married man and replaced his wife in society's eyes. She wore a crimson dress, her makeup sharp and deliberate, her expression a mixture of defiance and satisfaction. She kept her manicured hand resting lightly on Ramiz's arm, a silent display of ownership, as if reminding everyone that she had already won. And then there was Anaya taught across the aisle. The pregnant wife sat quietly, her body draped in a modest, pastel outfit that contrasted starkly with Nia's flamboyance. Her hands instinctively cradled her rounded belly, her posture fragile yet determined. Though her eyes carried shadows of sleepless nights and silent tears, there was a dignity in her presence that no humiliation could erase. She refused to crumble, even as the man she had loved once looked at her with cold detachment. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, words darting like arrows through the air. Can you believe he left her while she's pregnant? For that woman? They say he's even fighting for custody of the child? Every whisper pierced Anaya's chest, but she kept her gaze steady, her lips pressed in silence. Her strength wasn't loud, it was quiet, simmering, waiting. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of the gavel striking would demanded silence. Heads turned as the judge entered, an older man with a face carved in stern lines, his expression unreadable. His black robe trailed behind him, a cloak of authority that instantly commanded respect. He took his seat, scanning the room with a piercing gaze that made even the lawyers straighten nervously in their chairs. No one in that room knew his secret. No one suspected that behind that stoic mask, a storm of hidden emotions awaited its time. For now, he was simply the judge, detached, neutral, an arbiter of justice. Court is now in session. His voice boomed, deep and controlled. Anaya's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, as though the walls themselves carried the judgment of society. She inhaled deeply, placing her palm protectively over her stomach. For her child, she would endure this. For her child, she would fight. Ramiz leaned toward Nia, whispering something that made her smirk. Their arrogance was palpable, as though the outcome had already been bought and sealed. To them, Anaya was nothing more than an obstacle to bay. Crushed, the lawyers shuffled their papers, preparing their opening statements. A photographer outside the window snapped blurred images through the glass, the flashes reflecting like lightning in a brewing storm. The trial was about to begin. The air grew thicker, silence more oppressive, as if the entire city had paused to witness the fall of a woman, or perhaps her rise. And in the stillness of that courtroom, as the gavel struck once more, Anaya lifted her eyes not at Ramiz, not at Neha, but at the judge himself. Something about his gaze unsettled her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was something else, something she couldn't yet name. The trial had begun, and with it, the unraveling of secrets no one in that room could have predicted. The courtroom's heavy silence faded in Anaya's mind, replaced by the echo of memories that felt like another lifetime. For a brief moment, as she sat across from Ramiz, she was no longer in a courtroom. She was back at the beginning, when love had seemed eternal and betrayal was unthinkable. Ramiz had once been everything she dreamed of. He wasn't born a millionaire. He had clawed his way up from nothing, and in those days, His hunger for success had been wrapped in charm and warmth. Anaya remembered the first time she saw him standing in the rain outside a university library, offering her his umbrella with a crooked smile. She had laughed at the gesture, but his persistence melted her resistance. Slowly, conversations turned into late-night calls into promises, and promises into a whirlwind romance that ended at the altar. Their wedding had been modest but filled with joy. Ramiz had held her hand and whispered, "We'll build our empire together, Anaya, you and me against the world." Those words had anchored themselves deep into her heart. She believed in him, in his dream, in their shared future. She had no idea then how quickly dreams could turn into illusions. In the early years, life felt like a fairy tale. Their tiny apartment was crowded with mismatched furniture, but it was warm with laughter. Ramiz would return home late at night, exhausted but glowing with ambition, and Anaya would wait with food and endless encouragement. They were partners, or so she thought. She sacrificed her career dreams so he could chase his, always reminding him that he wasn't alone. But money changes people, and success changes them even more. As Ramiz's business ventures flourished, his charm evolved into arrogance. The man who once cherished late-night walks with her now preferred lavish parties, filled with people who spoke the language of money and power. Anaya tried to keep up, but she didn't belong in that world. Her simplicity, once the very thing he adored, now seemed to embarrass him. The first cracks appeared in the form of indifference. He stopped asking about her day, stopped noticing when she stayed awake waiting for him, stopped caring when she quietly decorated their home with touches of love. Soon, his absences grew longer, his temper shorter. The Ramiz, who once promised you and me against the world, now made her feel as if she was standing on the other side of a wall he had built. And then came Neha. Anaya remembered the night she first heard the name. A charity gala, where Ramiz introduced a striking woman in a red gown, with the words, "She's handling some of my business expansions." The way his hand lingered at Neha's lower back, the way her laughter seemed designed only for him, made Anaya's stomach twist. But she told herself it was her imagination. Ramiz wouldn't do that. Not him. Not the man she trusted with her whole soul. Denial is a quiet poison. It wasn't long before denial gave way to truth. The late-night meetings that turned into excuses. The scent of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts. The way Neha's name slipped too easily from his lips, it all painted a picture Anaya could no longer ignore. She confronted him once, her voice trembling. "Ramiz, are you with her?" His silence said everything. When he finally spoke, it was colder than the truth itself. "Neha understands me, Anaya. She pushes me. You hold me back." The words sliced deeper than any blade. Hold him back. She had been the one who built him up, who believed in him when no one else did. And now, she was reduced to a weight, a chain he wanted to cut free from. Humiliation became her constant shadow. Friends whispered behind her back, pitying her, while society judged her for not being enough to keep her husband. Neha, emboldened by Ramiz's favor, flaunted her place, shamelessly appearing at business dinners, sitting where Anaya once sat, claiming the spotlight with cruel satisfaction. Isolation wrapped itself around Anaya, like chains. The once lively home became suffocatingly quiet. Even her pregnancy, which should have been a moment of joy, became a lonely battle. Instead of excitement, Ramiz had greeted the news with irritation, as if the child were an inconvenience to his new life. Nights were the worst. Lying awake, Anaya would clutch her belly, whispering promises to her unborn child. "I'll never leave you. I'll protect you, no matter what." In those whispers, she found fragments of strength. But the ache of betrayal never left. She had loved him with everything she had. She had built her world around him. And in return, he had handed her broken dreams and public humiliation as she blinked back to the present. Sitting in the courtroom, Anaya's gaze shifted to Ramiz and Neha. the smirk on his face, the gleam of victory in Niha's eyes. It was all built on lies and cruelty. And though her body trembled under the weight of memory, her heart whispered that the story wasn't over. Not yet. The rumors about Ramiz and Niha had long ceased being whispers. They had turned into headlines. Every magazine, every society column seemed to flaunt their appearances together. Anaya, carrying the weight of her pregnancy and her broken heart, became an invisible shadow in her own story, while Niha basked in the glow of stolen spotlight. But humiliation reached its peak on one unforgettable evening. It was a business launch party, one that Anaya had been invited to out of courtesy, not respect. She had debated staying home, but part of her still clung to the hope that perhaps Rami would acknowledge her presence. When she entered the glittering ballroom, all eyes turned not in admiration, but in thinly veiled curiosity. Whispers trailed behind her like a cruel echo. There's the wife, still holding on. Poor thing. She looks so fragile. Anaya walked with quiet dignity, her hands resting on her rounded belly, her eyes searching the crowd, and then she saw them. Ramiz, in his flawless black tuxedo, stood at the center of the room, surrounded by powerful businessmen. But what stung was Niha, draped in a sequined gown that shimmered like a trophy, standing right by his side, as though she were the rightful queen. She laughed loudly, touched his arm possessively, and tilted her chin in triumph. When her gaze fell on Anaya, it was deliberate. Every gesture Niha made was a performance, crafted to remind Anaya that she had been replaced. Anaya tried to slip away to a quiet corner, to disappear into the background, but Niha wouldn't allow it. Like a predator smelling weakness, she approached, heels clicking against the marble floor, her smile sharp and venomous. Well, if it isn't the wife," Niha purred, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. "How brave of you to show up." Anaya stiffened, her heart pounding, but she kept her voice calm. "I came to support my husband's work. That's all." Nia's laughter rang out, brittle and cruel. "Husband?" She leaned closer, her eyes glittering with malice. "Oh, darling, that's such a generous word. Everyone here knows you're nothing but baggage. And that baby." She let her gaze slide mockingly down to Anaya's stomach. "Dead weight. He doesn't need." Gasps fluttered through the crowd, and Anaya's cheeks burned with shame. For a moment, she thought Ramiz would step in, defend her, stop Niha from going too far. But when she looked at him, all she saw was cold detachment. His face was unreadable, his silence complicit. The cruelty didn't end there. Niha suddenly raised her hand and, with deliberate venom, slapped Anaya across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Anaya staggered back, her palm instinctively flying to her cheek, eyes wide with shock. The humiliation was complete, delivered in front of dozens of witnesses. Cemented by Ramiz's chilling indifference, Niha smirked, her voice dripping with poison. "Remember this, sweetheart, too, and that child will never belong in his world." The crowd shifted uneasily, some murmuring disapproval, others too afraid of Ramiz's power to intervene. Anaya felt the tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood taller, her hand still protectively over her stomach, and whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "You're wrong. My child is my world." For a flicker of a moment, Nia's smirk faltered, as though she sensed that despite her cruelty, Anaya's quiet strength had not been broken. But then she turned away, linking her arm with Ramiz, who walked beside her, without a backward glance. The ballroom buzzed again, the slap becoming instant gossip. The image of a pregnant wife publicly humiliated seared into everyone's memory. But for Anaya, the sting on her cheek was nothing compared to the fire that began to burn inside her heart. That night, something shifted. Niha's slap wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was the spark that lit the flame of Anaya's resolve. Pregnancy was supposed to be a time of joy, a season of anticipation, laughter, and soft lullabies. For Anaya, it became a battlefield. Every day was a fight between her weakening body and her unbreakable will, between the weight of loneliness and the fragile light of hope. The cruelty of Neha's slap still burned in her memory, but even more painful was the coldness in Rames's eyes. The man who once promised to love her forever. He had left her to fend for herself, withdrawing not just his affection, but also the basic comfort of companionship. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with silence so heavy that it pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Yet, in the middle of this darkness, one truth gave her strength, her unborn child. Every flutter inside her belly was a reminder that she wasn't truly alone. Every tiny movement was like a whisper, urging her to keep going. She would sit in the small bedroom she now lived in, her hands gently curved around her stomach, whispering softly, "Don't worry, my love, I'm here. I'll protect you, no matter what." There were days when the shadows tried to swallow. Her whole depression crept in, like an uninvited guest, filling her thoughts with questions that stabbed at her heart. What if I can't raise this child alone? What if I'm not strong enough? What if they take my baby away? But each time, the warmth of life inside her pushed those doubts back, reminding her that giving up was not an option. Health scares tested her further. Stress weighed heavily on her pregnancy, leading to dizzy spells and fainting fits. One evening, she collapsed while reaching for a glass of water, her body trembling with weakness. As neighbors rushed her to a clinic, she clutched her belly, whispering, "Please, stay with me. Don't leave me." The doctors warned her. Too much stress, too much neglect, and the baby's life could be at risk. But if Rames heard of her struggles, he didn't care. He didn't come. He didn't call. And Neha, cruel as ever, made sure to spread lies about her fragile state, painting Anaya as weak, unfit, unworthy of motherhood. In those moments of despair, Anaya clung to small flashes of happier times. She remembered the early days of her marriage, the way Rames used to rush home with street food just to see her smile. The nights they stayed up planning names for their future children. She remembered sitting with him on their rooftop, watching stars, when he said, "One day, we'll tell our kids how we built everything from scratch." Those memories, once a source of pain, slowly became fuel. If she could survive that happiness, once, she could survive this grief now. Symbolic rituals became her lifeline. Every morning, she sat by the window, resting her hand on her belly, whispering promises. "You will never feel unwanted. You will never feel unloved. You are my strength, my reason, my future." In those whispered vows, she rebuilt her broken spirit, piece by piece. One night, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the glass. Anaya sat by the window, tears streaming down her face, but her arms protectively wrapped around her stomach. She whispered through her sobs, "We will rise from this. No matter how much they try to break us, we will rise." The storm outside seemed to answer with thunder, as if the universe itself was listening. It was in those quiet, painful moments that Anaya transformed. She was no longer just a wife abandoned, or a woman humiliated. She was a mother, a shield, a survivor, and with every passing day, the fire in her heart grew stronger, preparing her for the battles yet to come. The day the divorce papers arrived, Anaya felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had expected abandonment, cruelty, and even indifference, but the document in her trembling hands carried something far more brutal. Rames wasn't just discarding her. He was fighting for custody of the child she carried in her womb. The words blurred as her eyes filled with tears. Neha's fingerprints were all over this. It wasn't enough that she had stolen Rames. She wanted to strip Anaya of her dignity, her motherhood, her very reason to live. Custody, Anaya whispered, clutching her stomach. "How can they try to take you away before you're even born?" The answer lay in Rames's growing arrogance. With Nia's influence, he had convinced himself that Anaya was unfit, fragile, unstable. Together, they spun a narrative. A pregnant woman, too emotional, too weak, too depressed to raise a child. They would do whatever it took to make that fiction a legal reality. When the first hearing was announced, the courtroom became a battlefield. Ramiz arrived with a fleet of lawyers, sharp-suited men, with briefcases filled not with truth, but with weapons of manipulation. Neha strutted in beside him, her presence unnecessary but deliberate, as though reminding Anaya that she wasn't just losing a husband, she was losing her entire life. The opposing counsel wasted no time. Their strategy was clear: destroy Anaya's credibility. They painted her as unstable, showing fabricated reports of emotional breakdowns, citing exaggerated medical notes that hinted at stress-related complications, even twisting her fainting spell at the clinic into a story of incompetence. She is unfit to be a mother, one of the lawyers declared, his voice cutting across the courtroom. She endangers not only herself, but the unborn child. My client, Mr. Ramiz, wishes to provide the child with a stable, loving environment. The words were knives. A stable, loving environment with Neha at the center. The very thought made Anaya's stomach churn. But Anaya was not entirely alone. Sitting beside her was Samina, a woman whose presence radiated quiet authority. Unlike Ramiz's expensive team, Samina was not hired for prestige, but for conviction. She had built her career defending women abandoned and mistreated, women who were told they were too weak to fight. When she had first met Anaya, she had simply said, "You have a case, and more importantly, you have the truth. That's stronger than their lies." In the courtroom, Samina rose, with a calm fierceness. "Your Honor, the opposing counsel dares to present a narrative that vilifies a mother for enduring hardship. They twist her struggles into weaknesses, but every medical record they have presented lacks proper authentication. What we see is not truth, but fabrication." She turned toward Ramiz, her voice sharpening. "And let us not forget, while Mrs. Anaya battled depression and loneliness, where was her husband? Absent. While she fainted from stress, where was her support? This child, it is those who abandoned her." Her words sent ripples through the courtroom. For the first time, Ramiz's smug expression faltered, but Nia tightened her grip on his arm, urging him to stay composed. The hearings stretched over days. Each session brought new assaults. Ramiz's lawyers paraded false witnesses. House staff bribed to testify that Anaya had violent outbursts. Neighbors coached to claim she was paranoid. Nia even took the stand once, pretending concern as she told the court, "I've seen how unstable she is. This baby, it needs security. Ramiz and I can give that." The hypocrisy was unbearable. Every word that left Neha's lips was venom wrapped in sugar. But the courtroom listened, some skeptical, others convinced. For Anaya, the pressure was suffocating. There were moments when she broke down on the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted her loneliness, the abandonment, the humiliation of being slapped in public. Ramiz's lawyers pounced on her tears, pointing to them as proof of instability. But Samina countered brilliantly. "Tears do not prove weakness, they prove humanity. What we see is not instability, but the natural grief of a woman betrayed by those who swore to protect her." Slowly, the tide began to shift. Some members of the audience, journalists, observers, even a few jurors started to see through the glossy lies of Ramiz's team. Sympathy grew for the fragile yet dignified woman clutching her stomach protectively in every session. Still, the battle took its toll. Anaya would return home after each hearing drained, her body aching, her spirit tested. But every time despair threatened to swallow her, she would rest her hand on her belly and whisper, "We're still here. They won't win. I won't let them." For all of Ramiz's money and Neha's cruelty, Anaya had something they could never buy: the truth and a mother's love. And though the war was far from over, one thing was becoming clear: this was not just a legal battle. It was a war for dignity, for survival, for the right to be heard, and Anaya was ready to fight it till the end. The courtroom that day was more crowded than ever. Reporters filled the benches. their pens poised like weapons, ready to capture every scandalous detail. Society figures whispered behind their veils and polished shoes, their eyes darting between Anna Eufrail but composed and Nia, whose smugness grew bolder with every passing session. Tension hung thick in the air as Anaya took the stand once again. Her voice was steady but low, recounting the nights of abandonment, the humiliation she endured, the isolation of pregnancy without support. Each word seemed to chip away at the facade of perfection Ramiz and Nia tried to maintain. Some questions were calm and respectful. "Mrs. Anaya, what gave you the strength to continue despite your husband's absence?" Anaya placed a hand on her belly, her voice trembling with emotion. "My child, I speak to her every night. She is the reason I survive." The audience stirred. A few women dabbed at their eyes. For the first time, the courtroom leaned toward Anaya's side, moved not by theatrics, but by quiet truth. But Neha could not tolerate it. Sitting beside Rameh, she gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles whitened. The sight of people softening toward Anaya, the thought of losing control of the narrative, sent fury rushing through her veins. She whispered harshly to Ramiz, "She's manipulating them." Ramiz, trying to remain composed, whispered back, "Calm down. Let the lawyers handle it." But Nia was already on her feet. Ignoring the startled gasps of the audience, she strode toward Anaya with sharp, furious steps. "You liar," Nia hissed, her voice echoing across the chamber. "How dare you play the victim? How dare you act as if you deserve sympathy?" The judge slammed his gavel. "Ms. Neha, sit down immediately. This is highly inappropriate." But Nia didn't hear him more. Perhaps she chose not to. Her rage boiled over, and before anyone could stop her, her hand whipped across Anaya's face with a resounding crack. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Anaya staggered back, her hand instinctively flying to her cheek. The courtroom erupted gasps, shouts, cries of shock. Reporters scrambled to jot down every detail. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the moment of scandal. The judge's gavel thundered. "Order, order in the court." His voice carried the weight of authority, but the chaos was already spiraling. Samina rushed to Anaya's side, steadying her. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her eyes blazing with fury at Nia's audacity. Anaya, though trembling, nodded faintly. Her other hand immediately rested protectively on her stomach, shielding her unborn child as though her very soul depended on it. Ramiz finally rose, attempting to downplay the situation. "Your Honor, please. Neha is under stress. This case has dragged on for too long." "She didn't mean silence," the judge thundered, slamming his gavel again. His eyes burned with controlled rage. "This is a court of law, not a circus. Ms. Neha, your behavior is not only contemptuous, it is criminal. One more outburst, and I will have you removed." Neha, breathing heavily, seemed to realize what she had done, but instead of remorse, her expression twisted into smug satisfaction, as though daring the world to judge her. What she didn't realize was how swiftly the tide had turned. The audience, who once whispered against Anaya, now looked at her with sympathy. A pregnant woman, struck in open court by the mistress who stole her husband. No amount of money or manipulation could erase the cruelty of that image. Even the reporters, who had thrived on sensational headlines, began scribbling phrases that favored Anaya. Pregnant wife, humiliated in court. Mistress loses control, public sympathy shifts. Ramiz tried to mask his unease, but the truth was evident in the stiffness of his jaw. The slap wasn't just a moment of anger, it was a catastrophic mistake for Anaya. However, the sting on her cheek was not humiliation, it was revelation. She lifted her chin, her eyes glistening, but unbroken. With the entire courtroom watching, she whispered softly, almost like a vow to herself, "You can hurt me, but you'll never take my child." Her quiet defiance struck deeper than any slap could, From that moment forward, the case was no longer just about custody. It became a moral battle, a fight between cruelty and compassion, arrogance and dignity. And for the first time, Anaya felt the invisible tide of public opinion flowing toward her, carrying her closer to justice. The courtroom settled into uneasy silence after Neha's shocking outburst. The gavel strikes still echoed faintly in everyone's ears, but now all eyes turned toward the judge. His expression was stern, but there was something beneath the surface, something softer, almost protective. When Anaya was asked to return to the witness stand, she hesitated, still shaken. The judge leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering just enough to ease the sharp edges of the atmosphere. "Mrs. Anaya," he said gently, "do you need a moment before continuing? You may sit if standing causes you discomfort in your condition." The respectful tone startled her. Judges were rarely so considerate, especially in high-profile cases where time was money and emotions were treated as distractions. Anaya blinked, unsure how to respond, but nodded gratefully. Samina caught the brief exchange, her brows lifting in quiet intrigue. As the questioning continued, the judge's subtle interventions grew more noticeable. Whenever Rames's lawyers pressed too hard, framing questions in ways designed to trap Anaya, the judge would interrupt. "Counselor," he said sharply once, "rephrase that. She is not on trial for being a wife or a mother. Ask only what is relevant." The audience murmured at his tone. It wasn't favoritism, it was fairness. Yet there was a delicate restraint in the way he protected Anaya from being cornered, even during routine questions. His choice of words stood out. "Mrs. Anaya, when you say you felt unsafe," it was the kind of question that revealed empathy, that gave space for her truth rather than cutting her down. Anaya felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, safety. For the first time in months, she wasn't just defending herself, she was being heard. Yet there was also an odd pull, a sense that this man, this figure of authority cloaked in robes and impartiality, wasn't entirely distant. Something in his eyes lingered when she spoke, not inappropriate, but almost familiar. She brushed the thought away, convincing herself it was only gratitude mixed with exhaustion. After all, why would a judge look at her with such quiet recognition? Still, the subtle shifts did not go unnoticed. Reporters exchanged curious glances, scribbling notes. Samina studied the judge closely, and Anaya, though she didn't yet understand why, couldn't shake the feeling that fate had placed someone in that courtroom who saw far more than he revealed. The gavel's echo had long faded, but the weight of the day's drama lingered, like a heavy fog over the courthouse. For Anaya, the slap from Nia remained a sharp sting on her cheek and in her heart. Yet she sat quietly, unaware that an even greater revelation was about to shake the very foundation of her world. Flashback. A broken family years ago, when Anaya was only a child. She remembered the constant arguments between her mother and father. Their voices clashed like storms through thin walls. And even though she never fully understood the details, she knew love had died in that house long before she could hold on to it. One night, her mother had packed hurriedly, pulling Anaya along, with trembling hands. "We're leaving, Anaya. We're not safe here. Don't look back." Anaya's small eyes had searched the doorway, waiting for her father to appear, to call her name, to stop them. But he never came. For years, her mother's narrative was all she knew. He abandoned us. He chose his ambition over his family. He never loved you. And Anaya, too young to question, had carried that truth into her bones. She grew up believing she had been fatherless by his choice. The absence had carved deep scars, but she had learned to live with them. Or so she thought. Present day, the judge's chambers behind the closed doors of his chambers. The judge sat heavily at his desk, his hands trembling as he spread out old documents across the polished wood. Birth certificates, sealed family records, a faded photograph. Each piece was a dagger, confirming what his heart already knew. Anaya, he whispered the name like a prayer, his voice breaking. The name that had haunted him for decades. The daughter he had not seen since she was a little girl, with tearful eyes hiding behind her mother's skirts. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, as memories collided violently with the present. Back then, he had been a young man trying to balance ambition and family. His wife, proud and stubborn, had grown resentful of the long hours he dedicated to law school and early practice. They had fought bitterly until the night she left with their child. He had searched for them, begged for reconciliation, but she vanished into silence, refusing every letter, every attempt. She wanted a clean break, a new life, and she made. Sure, Anaya grew up believing her father had abandoned them, and now years later fate had led his daughter back to him. Not as a child to embrace, but as a plaintiff in his courtroom. A broken woman seeking justice against a cruel husband and an even crueler mistress. The judge's turmoil. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling the full weight of the robe he wore. Judicial neutrality. The sacred oath he had sworn suddenly clashed with every natural instinct of a father. How could he remain impartial when his own daughter stood fragile and pregnant before him, being humiliated, mocked, and even slapped? How could he watch her suffer, knowing he had already failed her once in life? The judge rose and paced the room, torn between duty and blood. His gavel, resting on the desk, now felt like a symbol of chains rather than authority. If I reveal the truth now, I compromise the case. They'll say I was biased from the start. They'll accuse me of corruption. Anaya's fight will collapse, and she will lose everything. Yet silence cut just as deeply. Watching her pain, holding his tongue, was like dying a little each day. The father's hidden glimpses, he recalled every moment in court when she had spoken, how his heart had swelled and broken at once. Her soft voice, her quiet strength, it was his daughter's courage shining through, and he wanted to reach out, to protect her, to tell her, "You are not alone anymore." But he couldn't, not yet, so he had allowed himself only subtle gestures. A gentler tone when addressing her, a stricter hand against the defense when their cruelty crossed the line. The world saw a firm judge, only he knew he was a father, silently shielding what little he could without shattering the case. Anaya's uneasy feeling meanwhile. In the courtroom, Anaya herself had felt something odd whenever the judge spoke. She couldn't explain it. His eyes lingered on hers with an intensity that was neither cold nor distant, almost as though he knew her. There were flashes of warmth in his voice, moments where his concern seemed personal. It stirred questions she didn't dare voice. She shook them off, telling herself it was nothing more than exhaustion and desperation making her imagine kindness where none should exist. A silent vow back in chambers. The judge stood before the window, staring at the city lights. His reflection stared back at him, a man of law, a man of regret, and now, a father in secret. He clenched his fist and whispered, "I will not fail you again, Anaya. Whatever it takes, justice will be yours." It was not an oath spoken as a judge, but as a father who had finally found his lost child, and who would do everything within the bounds of law, and perhaps even beyond them, to protect her. The gavel would fall again tomorrow, but tonight, in the quiet of his chambers, a father's heart beat fiercely, preparing for the war ahead. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. Outside the courthouse, journalists swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward anyone connected to the case. Inside, the air was electric, charged with the expectation of an ending that would either crush or liberate Anaya. She sat quietly at her table, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. The weeks of humiliation, accusations, and lies had taken their toll, but her resolve had only grown stronger. Beside her, Samina adjusted her files with steady hands, a pillar of strength and calm. Across the aisle, Ramiz and Nia entered with arrogance dripping from every step. Ramiz wore his expensive suit like armor, his smirk daring anyone to challenge his crafted image. Nia, dressed in sharp elegance, leaned toward him with a sly smile, whispering something that made him chuckle. They radiated the confidence of people who believed money and manipulation always won. The defense's final gambit. The defense began their final presentation. One by one, false witnesses took the stand, paid actors rehearsing lies, each painting Anaya as unstable, vindictive, and unfit to be a mother. They produced fake documents, meticulously forged to show fabricated medical conditions and false financial irresponsibility. Your Honor, the defense lawyer declared dramatically, this woman is not a victim. She is a manipulator, trying to ruin a good man's life out of spite. She is unfit to raise a child. My client deserves full freedom from this toxic marriage. Every word was a dagger aimed at Anaya's character, but she sat still, her head held high. Only some clenched jaw betrayed her fury. Samina's turn to speak when it was her turn. Samina rose slowly, carrying nothing but her voice and truth. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking like a steady drumbeat. Your Honor, she began, her tone calm but unyielding. We have heard enough lies to fill a library. But what cannot be forged, what cannot be the human spirit. Look at this woman. She gestured toward Anaya, a mother, a survivor, a woman who has endured abuse, betrayal, and humiliation at the hands of the very people who vowed to love and protect her. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. She was drugged, mocked, abandoned, even slapped in this very courtroom, and yet she still stands. Not for herself alone, but for the life she carries, for her child's right to safety, for her dignity, which no amount of forged documents can erase. Samina's voice rose, resonant and fierce. This trial is not about wealth, nor power, nor status. It is about truth. And truth, Your Honor, does not bow to arrogance. It does not kneel to lies. Truth stands, and so does Anaya. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some people wiping tears. Even the stenographer's hands trembled as she typed Nia's last mockery. But Nia was not done. She leaned forward, smirking, her voice dripping venom. Truth, she scoffed. What truth? This pathetic woman can barely stand without shaking. She's nothing but a weakling hiding behind her pregnancy, begging for pity. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Anaya's lips parted, but before she could respond, the sound of wood striking wood silenced the room. The judge's gavel slammed down, the judge's breaking point for weeks he had endured, holding his tongue, balancing his oath with his blood. But at that moment he broke. His eyes blazed as he looked directly at Nia, then at Ramiz, and finally at the courtroom at large. Enough, he thundered, his voice shaking the very walls. I will not allow another word of humiliation to be spoken against this woman. The entire room froze. The judge rose to his feet, the weight of years etched across his face. He looked at Anaya, his expression softening, trembling between pride and sorrow. This woman you mock, he said, his voice cracking. This woman you have dragged through filth. This woman you have tried to break. She is more than a plaintiff in my court. She is my daughter. The words exploded like a storm. Gasps, shouts, the rustle of paper's chaos erupted as reporters leaped to their feet. Ramiz's smug smile shattered instantly. Nia's eyes widened, her face straining of color. The shockwave. Anaya sat frozen, her hand instinctively tightening over her belly. Your daughter, she whispered, barely audible. Her heart raced, torn between disbelief and an ache she hadn't known she still carried. The judge's eyes met hers, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself the truth. His gaze was both apology and love, a silent plea for forgiveness. Yes, Anaya, he said softly, though his voice still carried across the chamber. I am your father. Tears spilled down her cheeks, unbidden, unstoppable. The courtroom faded the lies, the cruelty, the noise. For a moment, there was only her and the man she had thought lost forever. The defendant's collapser maze leaped to his feet, shouting, "This is bias. This is corruption. This is a setup." But his voice trembled, and for the first time, his confidence faltered. Neha stammered, This can't be," but the words caught in her throat. The judge's gavel struck again, sharp and final. "Order. This court will not be mocked any longer. Justice will be served not by wealth, not by manipulation, but by truth, and the truth stands before us all." The balance of the trial had shifted irreversibly, and in that moment, Anaya realized that though betrayal had marked her life, destiny had returned her father to her not as a savior to erase her pain, but as a force to amplify her strength. The showdown was not over, but the tide had turned. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, as though time itself had frozen after the judge's explosive revelation. The words hung in the air like thunder that refused to fade. "This woman you have humiliated is my daughter." Gasps rippled across the gallery, whispers rushing from one row to another. The once-snide spectators now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Cameras from the press, which had been following the case out of tabloid curiosity, now burned to capture every flicker of expression across the faces of the condemned. Rames's confident smirk crumbled, his jaw tightened, his face drained of color. Neha, meanwhile, froze with her hand, clutching the edge of the table, her eyes darting wildly, as though searching for an escape that wasn't there. The arrogance that had defined her throughout the trial now melted into naked fear. For the first time, the mistress who had strutted so boldly looked small, cornered, and utterly powerless. The judge's gavel slammed against the desk, echoing, like a final warning shot. "This court will have order." His voice carried the dual weight of authority and paternal fury. He fixed his gaze firmly on Ramesh and Neha, his composure intact, though beneath the robe it was clear his emotions churned. "What I have heard throughout this trial, the deceit, the cruelty, the shameless disregard for this woman's dignity cannot be ignored. You sought to destroy not just her life, but the life of her unborn child." Anaya sat still, her hands trembling as she clutched her stomach protectively. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but for once they were not born of helplessness, they were tears of validation, of being seen and defended in a way she had thought was lost to her forever. Across from her, Ramesh shifted forward, his voice breaking. "Your Honor, this is a mistake. Enough." The judge's interruption silenced the entire hall. "You filed this case to strip a mother of her child, using false documents and corrupted witnesses. You dared to bring your mistress into this courtroom to humiliate your lawful wife. And when the mask slipped, she struck this woman in full view of the court." His voice thundered as he gestured toward Neha. "The cruelty displayed is staggering. The ruling was swift and merciless. Custody is awarded solely to Anaya. Divorce is granted in her favor. Any claims made by Ramesh are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, given the fraudulent evidence presented, this court recommends investigation into perjury, document forgery, and obstruction of justice." His gavel struck one final time. "This session is adjourned." Chaos erupted. Neha screamed as court officers moved to restrain her. "No, this isn't over. He belongs to me." Her shrieks echoed as she clawed at the table, her polished composure unraveling into hysteria. Ramesh remained slumped, his eyes vacant, as though the walls of his empire had collapsed inward. His name, once synonymous with wealth and power, would now be dragged through headlines as a fraud, an adulterer, and a man who had lost everything. Anaya, trembling but resolute, rose slowly to her feet. She could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her, not in judgment anymore, but in awe. For so long, she had endured whispers of pity and ridicule. Now, she walked out of the courtroom not as a victim, but as a woman who had fought and won against overwhelming odds. As she passed the judge, her father allowed himself one fleeting moment of softness, lowering his eyes in silent acknowledgement. It wasn't a reunion, not yet, but it was a bridge mended by truth and justice. Anaya offered him the faintest nod, her lips curving in a whisper of a smile before she turned away. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, but their shouts couldn't touch the bubble of peace around her. She laid her hand gently on her stomach, whispering, "We're free now, my love. We're safe." For the first time in years, Anaya felt not just relief, but hope. The chains were gone. Ahead of her stretched a future where she could breathe, live, and raise her child in dignity. And as the doors of the courthouse closed behind her, the world seemed to open. The sterile white walls of the hospital glowed softly under the early morning sun. Outside the maternity ward, the air was hushed, filled only with the faint rhythm of footsteps and the distant murmur of nurses. Within one of the private rooms, Anaya lay propped against her pillows, her hair damp against her temples, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet brighter than they had been in years. Cradled in her arms was the most precious gift life had ever given her, a healthy baby girl. Tiny fingers curled instinctively around her mother's thumb. Anaya gazed at her daughter, as though the world itself had been reborn. All the battles, the humiliation, the nights of tears, it had all led to this moment. She bent her head and kissed the baby's forehead, whispering, "We survived, my love. No one will ever hurt us again." At the doorway, unseen by her at first, stood the judge, her father. He had shed the black robe of authority and war. Instead, the quiet, vulnerable weight of a man rediscovering family. His hands were clasped behind his back, his shoulders tense, as though unsure if he belonged in this intimate circle of new life. Yet his eyes shimmered, soft with pride and a grief he could not voice for the years lost. For weeks after the trial, he had wrestled with how to reach out. But now, standing here, watching his daughter cradle his grandchild, he knew he could no longer remain a silent observer. The past had been fractured, but perhaps this child, the bridge between pain and healing, could unite them again. Anaya finally lifted her gaze. Noticing him, their eyes met. No words passed, yet something deeper than language was exchanged: recognition, forgiveness, and a tentative promise of belonging. She gave the faintest nod, an invitation. His breath caught as he stepped closer, drawn not just by duty, but by love, long suppressed. Beyond the window, the horizon blushed with the colors of dawn. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the room, painting mother, child, and grandfather in golden light. It was as if the world itself bore witness to their renewal. For Anaya, this sunrise was not just another morning, it was the beginning of a life defined not by betrayal,